Everybody, I'm Alex Catron. I'm the CEO of AI EDU, and we're here at AI EDU Studios DC edition. Very excited to have Greg Toppo, a reporter for the 74, one of the leading publications covering the education space, someone that I've talked to formally and informally over the past year, 2 years. Yeah. And Greg has been both a confidant and sort of a co-learner as we try to make sense of this space and sort of how technology and specifically artificial intelligence is changing education or not. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very excited to flip the script and put the mic in front of you and give you a chance to talk about, from the vantage point of a journalist mm-hmm. who's talked to a really wide range of folks in our space, what you're learning, mm-hmm. questions you're asking. But before we go into sort of the day-to-day and this AI moment, this AI zeitgeist, I'd love to zoom out a little bit and hear why don't you start with just sort of what you're doing at the 74, and then how did you come to cover education?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And just as a quick aside, most journalists hate being interviewed, by the way. So I'm good with it. I think we're gonna have a good time here. I cover a couple of things at the 74. It feels like it keeps changing, but I cover basically the intersection of AI and education. And I also have sort of I don't know if you'd call it a side hustle at the 74, but one of the things we're very interested in is the future of high school. And so one of the topics that I spend a lot of time on is writing about visiting and thinking about and writing about innovative high schools. And the two haven't quite merged yet. I expect we're going to be seeing more and more in the near future.
I mean, there's a lot of reporters covering AI.
Mm-hmm. A lot of good ones.
There's a lot of good ones, and a lot more today than there were 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Not that many covering AI plus education, mm-hmm. that intersection. Mm-hmm. How did you get to be doing specifically sort of this sort of view of the future of school and innovation?
Yeah. Well, I was interested in it for a number of years. I co-wrote a book in 2021 that actually looked at AI and education, specifically, interestingly enough, what it was going to do to high school. We were very interested in just sort of projecting forward what all these technological marvels, if you will, were going to, the effect they were going to have on education. I had a co-author, my co-author and I, he was an educator, he still is an educator. He and I wrote kind of, I thought it was a fun, really interesting book. We basically did a what if a high school principal fell asleep in 2020 and woke up in 2040 and then went and visited his old school. What would it look like? After all these technological changes we've been seeing. So sort of a Rip Van Winkle story interspersed with some reporting on what's happening actually now and different models of high school. So big picture, I've been thinking about this for a number of years. I've been covering AI, daily for 2 years and change at the 74. And it really began where, I think most of us started covering it, which is November 2022, yep. When ChatGPT sort of burst on the scene and people started, messing with it and freaking out about it and wondering what was going to happen, and decrying the death of the 5-paragraph essay, et cetera, et cetera. That was when we, as an institution, started really paying attention to it, and when I basically started saying, okay, this is something we need to cover full time.
Yeah, to me, because we were chatting earlier, you mentioned that did you do a story on GPT-2, or had you just sort of?
In the book, actually, one of the things that we looked at was, and it was actually not specifically related to education. It was just in 2019, I want to say, they were playing with AI. OpenAI was playing with the ways you could essentially make GPT-2 into kind of an approximation of a journalist. And actually the chapter in the book where we talk about it is where we talk about what's this going to do to journalism. And the example we gave, which of course you could imagine even more clearly now, was that it basically just they gave it a couple of words from a real existing, I can't remember, it was a Guardian story or something like that, and it just basically just went to town and wrote the whole story.
I remember reading that story. Actually.
Yeah, and it was lots of crazy stuff, and it was even I think one of the things they said at Luson was imagine a reanimated JFK, so just patently crazy stuff.
Yeah, I think GPT-2 was a time when there was, I think, only a couple hundred people in the world who had really had the chance to look under the hood of these language models. But for me, the zeitgeist moment that ChatGPT ushered in, because I've been in the AI space since 2014. Okay. AI has been around. I mean, you can actually go quite far back. I mean, some people argue the Turing computer, but machine learning reached technological maturity in industry in the 2010s. So AI was not a new conversation. There were plenty of people portending a lot of the stuff that is now reality today. It was sort of lived in the realm of futurism. I think the challenge for artificial intelligence in part was it was a concurrent technology with this suite of emerging tech, crypto, blockchain, virtual reality, much of which 3D printing, the metaverse, all this NFTs, and while there's actually arguments that a lot of those technologies are still nascent and will bloom in later years and will transform society in ways that people have predicted, they were clearly a bit ahead of their time if we're being gratuitous, right? And some of them are probably just like patently were overhyped and over embellished. And so I think there was this fatigue from, okay, the futurists are at it again, talking about some, crazy future. And, it was, I think people were understandably cynical and incredulous at some of the claims that were being made. ChatGPT put everything into their hands. It made it tangible in a way that it wasn't before. And I think in the abstract, people understood that there was an algorithm curating the content that they view. It's very hard to really wrap your head around, what that means. You're not really using it. You don't really understand what the weights are or even what that means. When you have a tool that's just and the user interface was really powerful, right? You just ask a question, you press enter, and you get this output. And these outputs were, astounding. I think today we're sort of, the bar continues to increase. But I think most people will be able to tell you like exactly the first thing that they put into, whether it was ChatGPT or Gemini or something else.
Where were you and what were you doing at the time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you been in education your whole life?
I actually, career? Sure.
We were all in education, or the first part of everybody's lives generally.
Exactly. I spent a long time in education. When I graduated from college, I actually got right into teaching. Actually was in a teacher prep program the Monday morning after I graduated from college, and stayed in elementary and secondary education for about the next 8 or 9 years. Mostly, I have to say, if I'm being honest, wanting to get the hell out of it as soon as I got in. Not quite sure how. I knew I wanted to write, knew I wanted to do something different. And about, like I said, 8 or 9 years in, I finally just said, okay, I need to change what I'm doing. And so started freelancing, doing lots of magazine pieces, and finally got my first staff job at a newspaper in New Mexico at the great paper, still exists, the Santa Fe New Mexican. And really just loved it. And had the time of my life there, spent 3 years there, and then went to Baltimore to work at the AP, spent 2 years at the AP in Baltimore, 2 more years at the AP in Washington, was there just in time for things like the Clinton impeachment, and ended up covering some of the Monica Lewinsky stuff. We actually, as luck would have it, I was the only person in the Baltimore bureau who lived a couple of blocks from the courthouse where the Linda Tripp wiretap case was taking place. So I ended up covering that. Anyway, on and on and on and on. After the AP in Washington, spent 15 years at USA Today, and was the national education writer there. During that time, wrote a book in 2015 that looked at the possibilities in learning games and really got kind of like a graduate level education, all my own, just almost entirely like self-taught, if you will, about the kind of how that works, how that sector works.
Gamified learning.
Yeah. And really had the time of my life. By then, I was really wanting to do something different, was kind of sick of the NCLB, race to the top, standards, testing, on and on and on, and just wanted to just explore something new and different and weird. And that was probably the most fun I've had in my career. And I'd love to actually maybe at some point talk about the parallels between what I saw then, this is now going on a decade ago, and what I'm seeing now with AI.
Yeah, so you found your way out. You're covering national politics.
Mm-hmm.
We were just talking to a reporter yesterday from one of the big publications, and people in education, I think sometimes there's a lot of stories of folks becoming cynical.
Mm-hmm.
Education's a tough place for people who are well-intentioned, trying to do work and have an impact, and there's just all of this systemic, a lot of systemic challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But national politics is its own cynicism factory.
Mm-hmm.
So you went from one very, place where a lot of jaded people to back to education. But at the 74, your reporting is interesting because it's it's longer form.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing much more of a deep dive. You're not I haven't seen too many process stories from you. And is that because of your remit at the 74? Or is that something that you're trying to be more intentional about in terms of, especially right now, there's so much to cover.
Yeah.
And AI is not a narrow space anymore. How do you think about sort of your beat, as it were? What is the frame or sort of the aperture that you're using?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in a way, the DNA of the 74 million is that, on the one hand, we're a national publication, so we don't have to be writing about the Cleveland School Board or what's happening at the State Board of Education in New Hampshire. So we're not worrying about those little processes unless they're interesting to us. So if there's something happening on a local level that we want to dip into, we can dip into it. The perfect example to me is the story I wrote a couple of weeks ago about this case in Massachusetts with the student who was students who were accused of cheating on a history project using AI. In a way, a local story. Is in a federal court in Boston, but we found it interesting enough where we just said, you know what, we need to write about this.
And yeah, I remember you reaching out to me for my thoughts on that story, and shortly thereafter, and it was around the time that your piece had come out. It started to really gain national traction.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's actually the first, but it certainly appears to be the first, at least the first example of this that has been talked about and covered nationally.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, was this actually the first time someone has gone to court challenging an accusation of cheating because they used ChatGPT?
Yeah. Here's the thing you need to know. We will never say first ever or never before or anything like any superlative like that unless we can absolutely prove it, because somebody always comes along and says, no, I was the first ever and I filed a lawsuit in 1988. And so, we basically, among the first or the known,
Okay.
first. So we will always hedge our bets. That said, as far as we can tell, it's the first. And it's an interesting case too.
It's an interesting case. Yeah. We'll link to your reporting on this. I also wrote a Substack that sort of was a follow-up, very much inspired by our conversations. The last, and I'll admit I haven't actually checked in on whether there have been any updates. The last thing that I have seen was a preliminary injunction,
right,
that was denied by the judge. And I remember when we had talked about this case, one of the things that you and I both sort of agreed on was we just don't know enough. We have one side of the story, which is the student is claiming that they were unfairly penalized, for cheating, when in reality, from the student's perspective, this was purely just a misunderstanding and miscommunication or lack of sufficient communication from the school about what constituted cheating. And I think there was a lot of reactionary outcry that was like, this is completely unfair. The student, shouldn't be penalized for the school just not being up to date or up to speed.
Not having a good policy.
But when I read the preliminary injunction, the judge actually quoted specific excerpts from the school academic integrity policy where they say, you're not supposed to use, technology. And they ensure they don't necessarily specifically name artificial intelligence, but so there was even the out of date academic integrity policy, I think arguably did cover it. But then the other sort of detail that I think was lost in some of the national coverage is the school had actually had a whole class where they talked about appropriate and inappropriate uses of ChatGPT.
Right. It was an English class, I think.
It was an English class.
And just for the record, the kid had been punished in a history class.
Yeah, and so what basically what the case kind of evolved into was, to me, very clearly the student cheated. And this was basically a semantic argument about whether, a policy in an English class is transferable to a social studies class. And, I'm not a student of the law, and I don't know exactly, I don't believe that there's been a ruling yet in the case. The judge seems pretty aligned with the school based on his commentary in the denial of the injunction. But I actually think that school in Massachusetts is an exemplar of what most schools should be doing. And sure, maybe I think there's probably a little bit of constructive feedback in terms of over communicating in this moment is always good. And if you're and it probably does make sense to clearly update your policies school-wide and be really intentional about letting kids know. But I also think that as a student, there is there's these gray areas even before ChatGPT. I mean, one of the points that I make when people ask, well, ChatGPT shouldn't be cheating because a student is just, using a tool. One of the questions I'll ask, and I'll be curious for your take on this, is imagine a student's writing an essay and it's an essay on Cold War history, and their parent is a professor of Cold War history.
Know where you're going with this, by the way.
And while they're writing the essay, their parent is sitting right next to them.
Right.
And, maybe not literally writing it, but helping them write every single thing, provide them with all this feedback, not just reviewing it and providing red lines, actually co-writing it with the student.
Right. Or there's a sculpture project and their dad's a sculptor.
Yeah. I mean, is that cheating? I mean, I if you were the teacher in that situation.
No, I think it's a great question, and I think to me the kind of the short answer to that, the short response is, transparency says you should indicate that I got help from my mom, who's a Cold War historian, or here are the contributions that she was able to offer. And it's interesting because I think a good teacher, maybe this goes back to, kind of like basic principles, like a good teacher would probably know, Alex's mom is a Cold War historian. So he's going to write a killer paper on, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think in a way, maybe that's beyond the pale for most teachers. Maybe they don't need to know that much about their students, but it's probably a good, smart teacher would know that. It's kind of the same thing. I think you should be able to expect from your students a kind of transparency about their work and their sources and the advantages they've got.
Because the student didn't appropriately cite their use of ChatGPT. And that was one of the things that they had covered in English class was, first of all, if you're going to use ChatGPT, you have to, I forget exactly how they framed it, but it was like the spirit was, you can't just type in one sentence and press enter. Right. Like the goal is that you're and if you're going to use it, like you have to cite it just in the same way that you'd cite an encyclopedia or some other sort of like online technology-based information product. And so I think that there is, but there's generally not. I think the point with the parent is there's not a right answer, but there is sort of the goal of education. The goal of an assignment is ultimately a student, sort of this like sort of productive struggle.
Yeah.
And I think this is where I'm very biased towards teachers in the debate about whether ChatGPT is cheating, because the answer is it's complicated. But ultimately, I think teachers actually have an instinct. And to your point, teachers know their students, and like they generally have a sense for whether something is like, kind of wildly out of scope of what that student was able to do. And I think the challenge is the parents, students are looking for sort of a blanket answer to a question that I think society and industry has not even really quite answered, because we have not figured out. I have not seen any company that has like really honed in on what does it look like for humans and language models to sort of co-create together. And so in this moment where we're actually figuring this out together, I think there needs to be some latitude.
And I think you're right. And another way of thinking about productive struggle is, effortful thinking, right? This is what school is about, right? This is basically practice for your brain, solving these problems. And I think if we're relying on a technology just to get the student to the end of the assignment, then we've lost the narrative. And to assume that kids aren't going to do that is naive.
And another reaction is, well, if students are cheating, it's simply because the assignment it's out of date. And I think there was an assumption that this was just sort of a standard book report.
Right.
But again, in the judge's denial of the preliminary injunction, so more was revealed about sort of the nature of the assignment.
Yeah.
And my understanding is the student got to choose the topic.
Right.
They were working in groups.
Right.
So a lot of components that we would actually generally advise teachers, like how do you design assignments and work that is more meaningful to students. I mean, there was a lot of agency provided to students, and it was also multifaceted. And interestingly, the reason the student got such a bad score on that assignment was because it wasn't even the final assignment that was turned in. It was the research and the outline, because I think the teacher's mindset was there were a few different ways that they could present what they learned. And so rather than grading everybody on just sort of like whether their PowerPoint was good or whether their report or their write-up was good, they were focusing on the process of gathering the knowledge, right? And so that's again like something that that's advice that we often give teachers is, you have to focus less on the work product and more on the process.
Right.
So could the assignment have been honed? Perhaps, but again, I find this an example of even when teachers in schools are doing everything right, kids are crafty, and I think there's, I guess you should get maybe some points for trying. I think this was a little bit
ham-handed.
Yeah, I guess it was ham-handed. I guess there's also a concern that teachers that, and I think this is actually reality. I think some teachers are incredulous at the idea that students would cheat. And so rather than interrogating, this is actually Victor Lee's research out of Stanford, and Victor's research, which I want to talk about, by the way, found that incidents of cheating post ChatGPT have not increased. And the hypothesis is that students are always going to use sort of like the latest tools to cheat. Like when I was in high school, we had our lunchrooms were these round tables, and so before our AP European history class with Mrs. Giannini, we kind of had a pact where like at least one person would have the homework done, and everybody would sort of pass the sheet around and sort of like copy the answers.
Okay.
And that was sort of an old school. That was like pre social media, and now students have TikTok and other
copy
other
and
forms.
paste. Your early copy and paste.
So I think part of the argument is that teachers are always going to. The worry is that teachers are taking it personally, that it's an affront to them that students would cheat when researchers like Victor Lee would say, teachers need to create learning experiences that students, sort of inherently understand and connect with their own world and that are meaningful.
Right. I love the word. I love the word. I've seen in a number of instances around this, the word artifacts, because I think to me, it's a powerful word. It's like, what are the artifacts you want as a teacher? Is it just, in Alex's history class, you just want, 8 questions answered, and if everybody gets the right, if everybody copies and pastes the right answer, then the work is done. Is that a satisfactory artifact, or do you want a different kind of artifact? Do you want something where individualism is essential? And I think we're coming up against that in terms of like what do teachers feel is like the satisfactory proof of learning? And in a way, like I hate to say it, this is a really interesting conversation for teachers to have, and for parents to have, and for students to have. So maybe like maybe this technology has really like forced that upon us. So let's do it. Let's have that conversation. I mean, we certainly weren't having this conversation 10, 15 years ago.
That's right.
So in a way, progress is upon us.
Yeah, and you cover the future of, is it high school or the future of school?
Future of high school.
Future of high school.
Yeah.
I've been a part of a lot of conversations with folks, and there's different sort of monikers for this. There's school transformation, reimagining education, reimagining schools,
right.
Schools of the future. And those conversations have been going on, and you can attest to this for decades.
Yeah. Centuries.
For centuries. And, as a nonprofit, as the head of a nonprofit, I spend more time than I care to admit, focusing on fundraising. And one of the phenomena in the education space, in K-12 specifically, has been a shrinking of the number of philanthropies and the amount of money that philanthropies are giving to education. And in part because they're sort of throwing up their arms. They're just like, we've been trying, and we're just not seeing the results. It's just too hard. And it's very multidimensional. You're trying to, address math scores, but the schools that you're working in are dealing with literally 100 different other sort of connected issues.
Yeah.
And I think philanthropy has been having trouble sort of like pushing that forward. I think, at a certain point, people are just exasperated. Not just the funders, but the stakeholders and the parents and all the folks that you need on board for this. And I'm curious if you see this, but from my vantage point, the powerful thing about artificial intelligence, perhaps even more so than what it can do in the classroom, and we can talk about sort of like how AI is going to transform the classroom, but to me, the bigger part of this moment is it has actually reinvigorated interest in this conversation about the future of school. And suddenly it feels relevant, tangible, and actionable, and conferences are selling out. And I think the challenge is, how do we make sure that the conversation stays on this question of what is the future of school without moving too quickly to the answer of, well, it's just AI tutors and hyper-personalized learning and just like throwing, products. Because basically I think the space has been inundated so quickly with generative AI products that, and I'm curious for your take on this, right? Is like AI products, certainly a component perhaps of this conversation. Like how much of the conversation about the future of school is truly about like the AI tools that we're going to use, as opposed to some of this more maybe philosophical or almost like the spirit, the conversation about like, what is the spirit of what we're actually trying to achieve?
That's a really good question. So I have many thoughts about this, and I think basically at the very base of this, you're right. There is a lot of interest in like what this is going to do. Like I think people's imaginations in 2022 were really fired by this, to your point, and now they're wondering, okay, how is this going to apply to my kid's school? Like what could they possibly do with this that will make a difference? I will say that it's probably a safe bet to say it's not going to make much of a difference just in terms of, basic achievement and NAEP scores. And we're already seeing, just last week we saw the, the flood of terrible, disappointing, very bad, no good NAEP scores.
Can you, just for our audience, explain NAEP?
Sure. National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a test given in various forms every 2 years or so. It basically tracks fourth and eighth graders' reading and math skills. And as we're seeing, now 5 years out of the beginning of the pandemic, they're just not really recovering in a lot of ways. In a couple of places they are. Louisiana, I thought, was a really interesting outlier where their skills of those kids, and I can't remember which group it was, but really defied sort of the expectations. But mostly, we're in a sort of a very kind of grim holding pattern. And it's been like that since actually before the pandemic, since like 2019, I want to say. Certainly the pandemic didn't help. So, but I don't think on the one hand, it's going to really have much of an effect, these new tools, these new ways of thinking on that, because it feels like very little, if anything, has any effect on that. And I'm not quite sure systemically why, other than that, there are lots of people who would say, we keep judging the standard for what it means to be basic and advanced, and so we're always chasing this standard that keeps incrementally increasing. But I think to me the really interesting question is like, what do we expect in terms of these tools, and like how much of that are we expecting to be student facing?
Right.
I would have thought at the beginning of all this 2 plus years ago, that it was going to be like all student facing. Like we were going to just get, tools that students are going to be using, 24/7. And it's just going to be just this sort of amazing revolution of kids just interacting with the technology and just doing different things and different kinds of learning. And it's just going to be, we can't predict it. I think to me, what I'm seeing, which I didn't predict, and that's just my lack of imagination, is to me the most interesting piece of this is not the student-facing stuff. It's the teacher-facing stuff. It's the applications that use AI to help teachers do, the kind of the basic tasks of life, the sorting and the kind of, in some sense, the drudgery, in some sense, figuring out what students should be doing at any given time. And that can be as basic as like, predicting who's going to be absent, or, you're familiar with all of these things. To me, those are the things I think we should really be paying more attention to. In a way, it's interesting because I talked to someone who said a couple weeks ago, who said, AI is weird enough right now and is so unpredictable that I think until we like figure out more about it and how it works and really what it does, I don't think we should put it in front of students at all. Like, let the adults mess with it. But students shouldn't have access to this. Anyway, I don't know how you feel about that, but
there's this assumption that we are the AI education project, and so oftentimes, I actually will often now start meetings with, like, this is what this meeting is not. We are not here to try to put AI in front of all of your students, or rather, we're not here to accelerate that process. There's, I think, a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of how to do that appropriately, safely, but also in a way that complements rather than replacing education. And I want to talk about like an anecdote specifically where that, like,
you're replacing teachers or replacing when you say complements?
Replacing that complements teachers.
Okay.
Yeah. But also that complements the learning process, right? I think, there is a world where you could imagine students. And in fact, if you go to China, they actually, I remember there's this picture that hit me really viscerally. It was students preparing for one of the big national exams in China. And they had this giant, like, I don't think it was even a gymnasium. I think it was a warehouse.
Okay.
And there was like 3,000 students in cubicles with headphones on, getting personalized learning. And it just hit me that even if the scores are higher, the idea of just a student sitting down in front of a computer all day, digesting information, there's something really wrong with that. And I see sort of flavors of that with this sort of obsession with AI tutoring. But it's complicated, right? Because actually AI tutoring is still really exciting and interesting as an after-school support, as a support for neurodivergent students, for students in special education more broadly. You're blind, if you're an English language learner, if you're deaf, right? This technology is sort of unequivocally going to add incredible value and in sort of like giving you access to learning that was otherwise, much harder to access. So it's very hard to say blanket, AI bans. I think AI bans, for that reason are sometimes looked down upon. And to me, that if I was a superintendent, it would be more like we're going to sort of just like pump the brakes. And you described it really well. We need to understand this technology. We can't just rely on what the vendors are telling us. And outside of the vendors, I've talked to most of the smart people who are really obsessed with this question, and most of the smartest people will admit that we don't have the answers yet.
And most of the vendors, by the way, in 12 months' time, are going to be moving on to something else.
If they have any capital left,
Right.
And so I think on the other, the challenges, if let's say we're superintendents, we're trying to design, this high school of the future. Maybe we should let's put those hats on. Let's go through some of the decisions that we have to make. So decision one, we don't have any new budget. We have a technology line item. We've been spending it now on things like smart boards, Chromebooks for students. We're keeping an eye on the, is it ENET? The government, there's a government subsidy for technology access, E-rate.
Oh, E-rate.
Yeah.
Sure.
We're keeping an eye on E-rate funding. We're worried that might expire. So we don't have too many extra dollars to spend, but maybe some stuff we can move around.
Okay.
The first decision is, we need to send some sort of a letter to parents and students explaining whether or not students are allowed to use ChatGPT. We're one step short of like writing an integrity policy, but what's sort of step one? Do we blanket ban while we figure it out, or do we encourage students to use it but ask them to be transparent about how they use it? I'll let you go first because
I think you let everybody download DeepSeek onto their Chromebook and call it a day. No, this is a really good question.
And for our audience, DeepSeek is the language model that was released by a company in China 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
Technically in December, there's an earlier version. Lots of privacy concerns there, yeah. So,
and it was built for cents on the dollar in comparison to
reportedly. Although there's actually some new reporting out. We'll come back to that.
Yeah, we can come back to that. My feeling is I don't think you send out a memo to everybody, to the parents and the kids. I think your first step is you give teachers some time to play around with it. And you really give them the opportunity to find a comfort level with it, find what is the most likely way they might employ it. Let them figure out like what the risks are. And I'm not saying it's like security, because I don't think most teachers know enough about that. You can read the 74 million to find out that, because we cover it really well. But I think you start with that. I think you start with teachers just playing with it, and I really do mean playing. And we can, I want to talk at some point about the perils that I'm seeing with the reporting that I did 10, 12, 15 years ago when games and learning, because I see a lot of similarities with that and with AI. But I think you do. I think you let teachers mess around with it and see what pops out. And maybe as part of that, you require them or strongly suggest that they like get together, once a week, once a month, and just let each other know, what the coolest aspect of this is.
Okay, I'm in line with that. So we don't ban. In fact, we just avoid that all the controversy around that by just not addressing it, because anyways, the kids are going to access it out of school.
Yeah.
They're going to access it on their phones.
Yeah.
A ban only really makes sense if we feel confident that we can enforce it.
Right.
And then the other thing that a ban does is it orients teachers to this defensive mode where rather than focusing on like learning the tool, they spend more time focusing on enforcement. I think my modification to what you're describing is, and this is a plug. This is the work that EDU does. We have cohorts of teachers and we facilitate those professional learning communities so that there's some structure.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to work with nonprofits like us to create those sandboxes, but I think it does help to have, some subject matter experts who can sort of helpfully guide teachers towards, some of the best, sort of like some proven ways to actually sort of like some scaffolds for their exploration.
Yeah.
But the other reason I think that's important is, ultimately what is likely happening in our district is teachers, and maybe even with the way we discovered, ChatGPT, I don't know that we were covering, my guess is as a superintendent, we're not reading Wired or, MIT Tech Review.
Right.
Maybe we saw a headline about ChatGPT, but we probably, before we actually got the chance to use it, my guess is a teacher went to the lunchroom and was just like, look at Sally's paper. It looks like it was literally written by a college professor.
Right.
And I asked her, I confronted her about it, and she showed me this crazy tool called ChatGPT. Like, check this out. But it's with that frame of like students are using this to cheat. But I think this idea of, I think as a superintendent or a co-superintendent, my answer to those teachers who are like, well, how do we deal with this? It's like you're trying to design a bank that is, impervious to being robbed. It really helps to consult with a bank robber who is, who's really thinking about how to do this. You have to get into the mind of somebody who is trying to cheat. And the way to do that is you need to use it yourself. There is no sort of cheat code, unintended, or shortcut or rule that we can put in. You're probably going to have to, if not definitely going to have to adapt some of your assignments. And you're not going to know how to adapt those assignments to be more resistant to cheating if you don't have a sense for how the tool could be used.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, right. I'll go for that. Find the kids who are doing the most mischief with it, and maybe even have some sort of like a regular round table or
like
something.
A white hat. We're actually doing that at a couple of the upcoming conferences that we're doing sessions that we're having teachers. I think we're literally calling them like cheat-a-thons, where we're going to have some like, sort of like traditional assignments. And we're going to spend the next hour literally cheating on these assignments. And we're going to show you how you could do it, sort of get into the mind of a student. We might even have some students get involved in that.
Love it.
How are there, as this wise superintendent who was around for the time of, gamified learning, what are those, you mentioned you saw some parallels there, like how, like, can you just talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, just like you're sort of suggesting here, I mean, the place where 10, 15 years ago, games and learning were the most interesting and where things were getting done that I found really exciting were places where an individual teacher had discovered something on their own or had discovered something with a group of friends or went to a conference and was like, oh my God, you got to play this game, or met some developer. Or became, a couple of them actually became like, game developers themselves, just literally teaching themselves. how to build this stuff. And I loved the excitement around that. I also loved what kinds of conversations were happening because of it. Because in a lot of instances, when teachers discovered really good learning games, say in something, especially something like math, which is really easily adapted to a game, the teachers were asking totally different kinds of questions than they had been before then. They were really in a way kind of like turning their curriculum inside out, because this one game or this group of games had just basically asked them to say to themselves, like, what is algebra? like why do we have algebra, and what the heck is it? And there's one game in particular that I wrote about in my book, was Dragon Box. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So this is by a French developer. And it basically asked students to kind of like almost like invent algebra from the ground up, and almost like discover like what X is and what X plus 1 equals Y is. So it really just kind of, like I said, just sort of turned everything inside out. When you have students doing that, when you have teachers getting excited about that, it's a totally different kind of conversation than, why can't my kids do algebra? Why aren't they interested in algebra? And I see I see the possibilities for that kind of thing with something like AI. If students can come at a math problem from a totally different point of view, or do different kinds of problem solving, then I think we're really in like a different place. Maybe, and you've probably experienced some of these things. I mean, you've probably seen teachers looking at some of these tools and getting pretty excited. I mean, the easy way to do it is just to ask ChatGPT or the easy and stupid way to do it is just to ask ChatGPT to give me 10 algebra problems, right?
Sure.
But there are other ways to recruit these tools to do, I think, much more fascinating things.
Yeah. So I'm going to sort of draw out from what you're saying that stands in contrast to, presumably there were lots of companies approaching districts and saying, here's a, gamified learning product.
Yeah.
Going to improve your math scores. Mm-hmm. You should put it in front of every single teacher.
Yeah.
And my guess is that those districts, as is often the case with new curriculum, they encountered a lot of pushback from teachers. Mm-hmm. It worked in some classes, didn't work in others. And so the challenge is, this is like, it'd be really nice if the answer to this question of like, how is AI going to transform learning? If it's just like, well, you just give just have teachers use AI to do X, Y, Z. They're going to have more time. They're going to personalize or use it to personalize learning in X, Y, Z ways. And then your goal is just get that in front of every single teacher, train them on how to use it exactly in that way. And something that's repeatable, prescriptive, and for districts like Prince George's County, where we're just up the street from here, where we're doing work, they have 10,000 teachers.
Yeah.
I suspect that the answer to the best outcomes in terms of how AI will transform education is similar to what you're describing, where it is sort of you create the conditions for teachers to sort of hyper customize and explore and use it as a force multiplier,
right,
with their own spin. And I guess a challenge for superintendent, for schools, or for school leaders is, for PGCPS, they have 10,000 teachers. You start with the sandbox, that learning community of 50 teachers, but you really want this to get to every classroom. And in fact, if you have a mind for, reaching the kids who are at risk, or most at risk of falling behind, they're very often in some of the lowest performing schools that really struggle to retain the brightest teachers. is there anything, whether it's from your time in sort of like gamified learning, but is like, how can this sort of get into the bloodstream? Like, what are the conditions for? I guess the way to describe this would be, it's almost like, what is your understanding of some of the best ways to build and enhance like the teacher workforce, and upskill them in the ways that they need to explore and understand and sort of like iterate on the technology in their own way?
I have a couple of thoughts, by the way, and I'll just preface this by saying I think a lot of people in the games and learning space would take exception to your use of the word gamified.
Okay.
They would say that gamification is kind of a lesser form of what they're doing. They're actually using games at a higher level than just sort of getting people to sort of behave a certain way. They would say that gamification is a little too low level. I don't want to spend much of our time talking about that, but I don't know. It's interesting. You use a phrase a second ago. Get into the bloodstream, and I guess I would maybe with your permission, like maybe explore that a little bit. Like so you're talking about like a virus getting into the bloodstream. Something being viral. I mean, why are things viral? In the sort of social sense, they're viral because somebody's really excited about it, or it's new, or different, or weird, or just getting something done in a way that we've never seen before, and so people get excited about it. I'm not sure where you go from there, but I do see the like almost like the necessity of getting people excited. And maybe it's like just one big natural experiment, like where the people who are excited about something, test it out and try it out and, have certain amount of success, and the vast majority don't have access to it. And either their results aren't as good, or maybe their teacher satisfaction isn't as high, or, I'm not familiar enough with sort of the way systems like these work to be able to say, yeah, this is all you need to do is just,
Well, I think even the deepest experts in teacher professional learning would struggle to answer this question, right? There is no there is no quick fix. Is the challenge. This idea of like the components of virality, it has to catch people's attention.
Yeah.
In education, if something works, presumably, that is the type of thing that teachers are going to be talking about. Mm-hmm. If something doesn't work, or for whatever reason they're perceiving that it doesn't work, then they're going to resist, and also they're just in many ways, especially if a teacher of like 10 plus years, they're on cruise control. They've been teaching this class. Mm-hmm. It really is going to take something profound for them to change course. It's a lot of work. You kind of have your script, your lectures down pat. You have the homework assignments, so it's not trivial, even if something is pretty good. Mm-hmm. And I guess so. I do see the lever is this idea of, if you find the right teachers, they actually can be catalysts. Mm-hmm. I think I bought into that. I'd be curious. We don't have to answer this now, but I think one of our wonderings, if you come across anything like this in terms of analogs that we can find, mm-hmm. Where really successful, whether it's curricula or like teaching practices, project-based learning, we're big proponents of that. Most of our curriculum is PBL or inquiry-based learning. A lot of the schools that we work with have struggled mightily mm-hmm. to get project-based learning into the classroom, and I think the answer in part is because they just have project-based learning and is sometimes perceived to be at odds with like the standards and all the rigor, content knowledge and the rigor that teachers are expected. And so their teachers are getting these conflicting messages where mm-hmm. they're being told you need to have more project-based learning. And then their salaries in some cases are literally determined by how their students are scoring on these mm-hmm. sort of like very rigid standards. Yeah. Okay. Being a superintendent is really hard. So I think this is our chance to take off those hats. Thankfully. Thank God.
Okay, so I don't have to be a superintendent anymore. Okay, good.
No, not anymore. Put your journalist hat back on. There's so much happening right now in AI. What are the stories that you're just keeping an eye on? I'm especially interested if you're willing, anything that you maybe haven't covered yet, but that you're, just trying to learn more about that we could sort of like dive into.
Sure. I'm actually going to be, and this is not a self-promotional plug, but what the heck? At South by Southwest, I'm going to be doing a panel with folks from Curriculum Associates and Khan Academy about AI and assessment. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about AI's potential to mess with assessment and improve it and make it, the word I would use would be sort of more invisible. I wrote a story a couple of months ago about Curriculum Associates buying this Irish startup that has developed speech recognition for kids. And it seems like a minor thing, but I think it's kind of huge in a way because, it's one thing for, an 8-year-old or 9-year-old to be able to ask Alexa, to play a song or turn on the lights or whatever. But imagine a 3 or 4-year-old being able to do that. I actually have personal experience with that. I've got a 3.5-year-old grandson who has figured out how to very clearly ask Alexa to do stuff. But I think that's rare. And so they have developed essentially a way to help with AI, help computers understand the utterances of very small children. And this is, it doesn't take much imagination to think like, okay, if I'm a preschool teacher or kindergarten teacher, this really revolutionizes what I can do with instruction because I can sit an entire class down and just have them read into a tablet or a microphone or what have you, and on their own, by the way, and not even in the presence of a teacher, just have them open up a passage and read it, and have the AI assess how well this kid is reading. That's in a way that's one of the examples of to me. I was going back to something we were talking about earlier. Like that's not really student-facing AI in a sense. It's AI for the teacher's sake, and I think that's a really exciting aspect of this. And I think it, if you want to talk about force multipliers, that I think that could be really cool. And I'm excited about like the ways in which technology can play with assessments in other ways. Maybe make them absolutely invisible. Maybe take let's say work a student is doing already in class and essentially make the work into the assessment, right? Where you don't have to stop and take a test on a chapter you just read because the system is already swallowed up all the responses you've just offered over the course of a week or a month or what, or a unit or what have you. This, getting back to the games piece, I mean, this is what games do, right? Games assess you constantly all the time from the minute one to the end of the game, right? That's one of the things people love about games, right? They're constantly being assessed, but in a way that is invisible. And I think with AI, we have the potential to do that in a way we'd never have before. Again, it's not student facing; it's totally teacher facing, right? But it does something we couldn't do before.
Yeah, I'm.
You're skeptical, or you?
Well, I'm not skeptical. I just imagine the perfect iteration of this, where you'd probably get the best outcomes.
Yeah.
From the perspective of like accurately assessing students, would be to embed AI in obviously the students' Chromebooks, every single homework assignment, if they have access to some kind of a chatbot or a tutor, that data is all digested. There's probably like the classrooms recorded, maybe with video as well. And let's just assume, let's take for granted that we've absolutely solved the privacy aspect, right? Like the data is anonymized, and so I'm not. My skepticism doesn't come from a space of like, oh, like data privacy. But in this world, presumably we wouldn't just use it for an individual class. The students, you could use the same approach to evaluate the student over the course of their entire year, and then over the course of their entire academic career. And perhaps we don't need college exam, or perhaps we don't need SATs or college applications, colleges. But in that world, it's kind of like the sorting hat. It's like you're told, here are the 3 colleges that you can choose from.
Yeah.
And
I think I understand what you're saying. So it feels like you're getting ahead of yourself.
So I'm absolutely getting ahead of myself. I don't know if that's 10 years away, 20 years away.
Yeah. I
do think that it feels inevitable. And it's sort of like we just have to make a choice as society that that's the direction we're comfortable going down. And if not, I suppose then the question is simply, how do we build in a sufficient amount of student agency? And I think we've done similar things in the space of like using AI to screen like resumes. I think at least in many places, like even though you theoretically like AIDU, we don't use any AI to screen our resumes, even though we clearly could, because we just made this decision. So sort of like a normative decision about not wanting to surrender that process to the AI. I just wonder if like, are we sleepwalking into sort of this world where students are sort of just, there's the Ayn Rand book where everybody's sort of just told what their job is. And so is your take that's just so far out? You went very dark, very fast with what I was saying. I guess I was just envisioning, and I think a lot of people are envisioning just a more seamless transition from work and thinking to assessment product. So I guess because maybe the answer is there's some amount of this that because assessments are clearly need to be changed, right? So like the alternative, the flip side of this is the current assessment regime does not work, and it
works in a certain way, and that's how it works, and some of it's great and some of it's terrible.
Maybe assessments, it's not that they do not work, but there's a lot of room for improvement in assessments. And there seems to be a middle ground where we use technology to improve and enhance and address some of the gaps that exist in the education system. And maybe we just need to be sort of forward thinking about where do we need to sort of like draw the line.
I would say that. I guess maybe the thing I'm proposing is a little different. Maybe I'm not describing it very well. My feeling is that the best assessment is one that you don't even know just happened. That you are assessed on something because you've been working on it, let's say all day or all week. And at a certain point, the system has enough information about what you know and how well you know it that we're done. We're done here. Very, very much again, like a game, right? There's that great quote by, Jim G, who's this sort of games scholar. He says, if I get through every level of Halo, this is going back, 10, 15 years. If I get through every level of Halo, you don't need to give me a Halo final exam. Like I got through every level. I'm done. Right? I mastered the game. Right? There's no final test. And I think that's what a lot of people are envisioning. Now, whether that's got necessarily Ayn Rand implications to it because the student isn't choosing to sit for an exam, that's another really interesting question. But I guess I'm not quite there yet. I'm just thinking of what is the process we were able to just knock out, and what can we replace it with?
Yeah, I think you've convinced me that I am this sort of catastrophizing is maybe valuable for futurists and people who
Totally.
really, but actually I think I could also imagine the flip side where 10, 15 years from now, people are like, there was a time when you spent all this time in school and you did all this work and none of that mattered. All that mattered was just the score you got on this one test on one day. And if you happen to be sick or if you happen to be having a bad day, didn't matter.
Or if it was a bad test.
And oh, by the way, some of these tests are not very good.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of power then. There's all the other piece about this sort of recognition, like sort of natural language processing. One of the things that people have been saying about, well, assessments need to change, homework needs to change. We need to do more oral assessments.
Right.
And teachers will often kind of be a little bit, they'll scoff at that because they're like, I just don't have the time.
Yeah.
I just like homework is efficient because people are doing it simultaneously as opposed to like one turn at a time. So this is perhaps an example of a problem that AI perhaps created, but that it can also help to solve. I don't generally think that about every single problem AI creates, but I think this might be one of them.
Yeah.
It is a bit challenging when, have you seen that this has been, I think it's one specific person, but there's I think probably more than one on social media, applying for like management consulting interviews. And he has like his setup where he has like ChatGPT live transcription of all the questions that he's getting. And then it's like answering the question and he's sort of like reading it aloud and sort of like literally doing the interview, like acing these interviews with the help of his sort of like ChatGPT module.
That's great. That's great.
But
yeah, that's amazing. I guess I am of the opinion that, and I'm sure there's research on this. Maybe you can even cite it now. But there's a lot of wasted time in school, and I think the product of that is disengagement on the part of kids and dissatisfaction on the part of teachers. So if there's a way to close that gap, or not gap, but there's a way to get rid of some of that wasted time, and use it for something much more interesting. I'm not going to say productive, but
right.
Then I think that's a really interesting possibility.
Yeah, teacher retention is increasingly, I don't know if it's getting worse, but it's certainly really bad right now.
Yeah.
You wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about a survey that had come out. It was surveying schools of education. And I forget the specific numbers, but it was startlingly few colleges of education have any kind of a formal curriculum or approach to talking to teachers about language models or generative AI, let alone actually teaching them anything. And I was curious if any follow-ups on that. Have you?
No, I haven't. But to me, that on the one hand, I would say it's not a surprise, because I think a lot of colleges, a lot of teacher education programs are just, they're kind of trapped in the past. I don't think they've got much incentive to do something new and different, and innovative. And some of them probably with good reason, because they're being asked to churn out, a certain kind of product. I guess stepping back a little bit from that, I would say, I'm not sure if it's the job of a teacher's college to teach a 23-year-old about artificial intelligence. I mean, we're all learning about it in our spare time, and over breakfast, and it's, to me, it's kind of in a way, it's sort of like a responsibility that we all have, just to like we follow politics and the weather and climate and culture and music and all the rest. Feels like this is just another thing we should all be kind of learning about at a very basic level. My kids are interested in it. They're by no means like technically savvy. They just think it's an important thing to learn about. So I don't know. I'm not. I don't want to say I can give teachers colleges a pass. I just think it's just something. It's in the air, so it seems reasonable to expect that young people will just figure this stuff out at a certain basic level. Not I'm not saying like they don't need to learn all the ins and outs, but they certainly need to know how it's used and what it is, and what difference between the models, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, this is we recently, over the past like 2 years, we started shifting from talking about AI literacy to AI readiness. And that insight, I think, is sort of part of the reason behind that, and it's this idea that when I close my eyes and try to look into the future, I see a world where AI is it's so ubiquitous and seamless and invisible. It just seems it'll feel very like quaint that we would have to teach people how to use it, in the same way that my guess is that teacher colleges 20 years ago didn't have a class called like the internet.
Right. How to use your iPhone.
How to use your, I think that's exactly right. Mobile is even a better example, because that was, the early internet was actually kind of hard to use. And so there probably would have been beneficial for people to know. But yeah, there are no classes called how to use your phone.
Right.
And teachers colleges actually have a lot of important work to do, which is how do you build those durable skills, which is when we talk about AI readiness, sure, AI literacy is a part of it. We're assuming that that's actually going to be maybe one of the easiest parts, is like teaching people about what AI is and how to use it. The more important pieces is like building agency, critical thinking, and those soft and hard skills that, I think most teachers, whether they realize it or not, they have the knowledge and skills to get kids ready for the future. I just don't know that, 21st century skills has kind of been, it's been talked about so much that I think it's sort of lost its punch. My big sort of like scheme is, this is our chance to sort of reinvigorate 21st century skills and sort of almost like reframe it as AI is really just another way of talking about AI, 21st century skills.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a way, to me, I don't know, as I think about it, like how I use AI in like my daily life, I'm by no means like a technophile, I'm interested in it and I like to kind of think about it and explore it. But, in terms of like being a journalist, like to me, the most, once you dig in and start looking at these different models, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT or any of the other ones, the Google one, fascinating, that came out a couple of months ago, that allows you to create these crazy little 10-minute podcasts.
Oh, Notebook LM.
Notebook LM. We had a lot of fun with that. Not only in my house, but at work, we were playing with just feeding our news stories into it and just seeing what it created. But like, so once you get past that, the sort of basic literacy with that, and knowing what these things do and what they don't do and how one is different than the other, then to me the big challenge, and I'd like be interested in hearing your take on this, is keeping them at arm's length. I think that's really maybe the most important skill of all. And what I mean by that is like I would never use one of these models, certainly to write a story. Okay. That's like verboten. Okay. And I would never feel comfortable doing that. Right. I wouldn't even feel comfortable like taking like a report. Let's say, some government agency, sends out a PDF of a report. I wouldn't even feel comfortable asking Claude to like summarize this report.
Yeah.
Because like I who the hell knows what Claude's process is in doing this? In a way, like you almost want to do, like a kind of like a test of it. You want to take something that really well inside and out and ask these models to summarize it and then just see, what it's going to tell you. So I really feel like there's almost no way in which like relying on these models for something with any stakes is a good idea for me.
Yeah.
No, others may differ. I would, but I feel like at this point, February 2025, this may change in March or April, but I feel like, the place of something like AI is a very low stakes territory, right? I'm curious about something. I want to see something. I want to get the AI's take on something, but I'm not going to rely on it in any way, shape, or form. And I don't know if where that comports with your conception of this stuff, but it's almost like as a journalist, I think, have a kind of an allergy to relying on this stuff for something that really matters. So
Yeah, it does. The challenge is that it's really good in some cases, and you are a journalist with integrity who has respect for the craft. But I don't know the study. I think this is very hard to actually put a number on. But there's a large portion of the content now on the internet is AI generated. And if you go and read any sort of like sort of clickbaity SEO optimized blog posts, like a lot of that is AI generated. I know ad agencies are using AI to write things like ad copy. Like if you're doing programmatic ads, you now can not just do an A/B/C test. You can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way like 300
10,000
hyper personalized, 10,000 hyper personalized. But then there's like certain very specific applications where quality is not necessarily the measure. There isn't necessarily like sort of an integrity aspect, and you're not necessarily even as concerned about accuracy.
Yeah.
So setting those aside, I worry more about what you just described. So if you're reading a report and you're going to write about it, the way to really be able to write intelligently about something and add value beyond just all the noise, because we're in a world now where there's just like everybody has something to say about everything, and it's mostly service level. To actually add value, you have to really like deeply understand the thing that you're writing or talking about. And I just do not think there is any substitute. I was talking to one of my board members. She's a corporate lawyer. She has her own consultancy now, and so she advises really big blue chip clients, and she gets tapped to speak at these. They're esoteric legal conferences. So she was like, I think, doing a conference on financial services policy in Brussels, and like, oh, I've got this like keynote tomorrow, this presentation, I have to make all these slides, I have to like digest this like 70-page regulation or something. And I was like, well, perfect use case for AI. Why don't you use AI to summarize it? I hadn't even gotten to the place where I was still sort of taking for granted that AI was good at summarization. I have since found that it actually hallucinates maybe 20% of the time whenever I ask it to summarize. And so setting that aside, the fact that that's just incorrect, you should never use it to summarize if you're trying to like accurately reflect what's in a report. But let's just assume that even if it was 100% accurate, her point was, my like process for preparing to go and speak, and the reason I'm tapped to speak is not because I'm reading off of a series of bullet points or talking points that I've memorized. I actually am going up and like speaking as an authority figure. Right. And the only way that I'm going to be able to like speak authoritatively and intelligently about this topic, like the process of actually reading those 70 pages and like writing out everything that I want to say, like that's how I get to a place where I'm ready to go and speak off the cuff. And my experience with writing has been absolutely, I just wrote something on DeepSeek on Substack, and I used I'll admit I used ChatGPT quite a lot. And the way I used it was I downloaded, I watched there's a lot of good YouTubers who had sort of like done like much deeper, longer, like a lot of the coverage was like 1,000 words. It's like hard to get into the weeds. So I went and watched like hour-long YouTube videos, got the transcripts, plugged that all into ChatGPT, had it sort of synthesize it, and then created my outline, and then sort of like had ChatGPT sort of expand out, in particular, like sort of like the technical explanations of how DeepSeek was, how DeepSeek was trained. But CJ and I worked on this together, and I think what we found is that it would it would get you something that's maybe like, a C plus, maybe a B minus. But to get something that's actually worth publishing, we basically rewrote almost every word.
Yeah.
Now it was helpful to have a little bit of a scaffold, but at the end of the day, I'm still unclear about whether the juice is worth the squeeze, because I couldn't have written that without watching all those videos myself. And I think that when you talk to folks, especially people who are really deep in the AI space, this is something that's really common, is like most people are not using these language models. The exception, I think, is like coding or like data science. I think there's some applications where it's just actually legitimately game changing. But I think for the humanities, I don't know about law. I only know the story from the lawyer that got disbarred or penalized for submitting a I don't know if it was a injunction or something, but some document that was like just wildly hallucinated and
right, making up cases or what have you. Yeah.
So my guess is most big law firms are not allowing their lawyers to use ChatGPT.
Yeah, I'm hoping that they're not.
What else are you covering?
Let's
and if
see.
not covering, what else are you just like tracking?
Yeah, as you'd expect, we're covering the new administration and seeing what's happening there with their work with executive orders and whatnot, and the fate of the Department of Education. We're really still interested in the future of high school. I'm always on the hunt for suggestions for the next school to visit. Just was just a couple of weeks ago, was up in Albany, visited a really, really fascinating school called Tech Valley High School. One of my favorite aspects of it is that when you walk through Tech Valley High School, you see almost no tech at all. It turns out that this school was originated at a time when people were very, very bullish on the idea of like incorporating schools into sort of like tech hubs. And so there's this area in Albany called Tech Valley, and the school sort of got its name from that. But it's very, it's almost, a humanities centered high school that just is sort of saddled with the name Tech Valley. Really cool high school, really interesting, individualization, lots of project-based learning, lots and lots of real focus on students' ability to get up and just like speak about topics. Really interesting place, and I think it's a model that I'm really seeing more and more, which is schools that are focusing on giving their students the ability to sort of be experts, if you will.
If there's someone listening that is the head of a school and they want to reach out to you, we'll share your contact information or your email.
I'm
or
just
whatever.
Greg at the 74million.org.
What advice would you give to a building principal who is trying to pitch their school? Like, what are the types of things you're looking for? 'Cause I'm sure you get a lot. I mean,
We actually don't get a lot of pitches. Interestingly enough, we've been writing these stories for a while now, and I do not get emails from people saying, "Come visit my school." maybe I should be happy with that. But no, it'd be great to hear from people. I think the problem is that it's hard without really spending some time with it, or talking to people, to know if they're really doing something innovative.
Yeah, I suppose more powerful for you to hear about a school, not directly from someone who's like, sort of like promoting it.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right.
Maybe just some parting advice for folks. I mean, I think one of the common threads of this conversation is, you clearly have this curiosity. It's been part of your entire career, and it hasn't always been AI. It was really sort of much more broad about sort of like the future of education. But you are now really, I think, one of like a very small group of journalists who are true. I don't know if you call yourself an expert, but as close as you can get to someone who like just deeply understands the intersection of these spaces. What advice would you give to our audience in terms of, for folks who are they're early on in the learning journey. They get it. Yeah, we need to sort of like learn more. Maybe they want to use ChatGPT and experiment, but are there any like specific like like outlets that you're following? I don't know. Is it like Reddit? Like how can they sort of just like keep their finger on the pulse?
I mean, my problem is I read everything. so,
what are your like? What's the best?
I mean, interestingly enough, one of the podcasts that I like is the Times podcast about tech, the Hard Fork.
Okay.
Love those
Kevin
guys.
Roos, yeah.
Kevin Roos. I think his coverage specifically is really, really, really well done. And he's covered a lot of the education/safety aspects of it. I cover, or excuse me, I read and follow, the skeptics, if you will. The Ben Riley. He's got a cognitive resonance. Who I will actually, if you don't mind my flogging you guys' incredible podcast that you did with the disagreement, which I'm hoping by the time this runs, it will be public. You guys, and I even said it at the time, I think on Twitter or X or wherever the heck it is, that the conversation you guys had back in the fall was like the best conversation I've heard so far about some of these issues, specifically things like tutoring and AI. I thought you guys were just remarkable in the way that you both agreed and disagreed at a very high level with lots and lots of respect for one another, but also were able to very carefully pry the threads from where you disagreed, and not scream at each other. I really enjoyed that, so I would recommend that highly. I follow Dan Meyer's blog. He's got a very specific focus on math, and I think that's a really important thing to think about when we're talking about this world. I've always been a big fan of Audrey Waters, who never met a piece of technology she liked. And it's interesting because like somebody like Audrey, for people who may not know very much about her, but she's been thinking and writing about this stuff for years and years. And I think one of the sort of the big themes she has really been focused on for as long as I've known her is this idea that Silicon Valley is not your friend. That there's a lot of dark thinking coming out of this place, and I just speaking from some of the stuff we're seeing with our new administration. I mean, without getting like political about it, I mean, I think you can see the self-serving aspect of a lot of what these guys are doing. And I don't think that's something we saw very clearly until now.
I think it's surprising they got it passed for as long as they did, because I don't think people would look at, car companies, oil companies, electricity companies, like all these, megalith, capitalist
Right.
institutions. Their incentive structures are highly oriented towards only one thing.
Yeah.
And they will push in whatever direction that they can. Right. So,
Yeah. No, I think that's right.
I guess I think it's interesting that you're naming some skeptics, because I actually think we have a lot to learn from the skeptics, because there's plenty of optimists, and there's a lot of legitimate optimists who are super smart, but then there's also a lot of optimists who are shilling, right? Like they are self-interested, whether it's they're either at companies or invested in those companies, invested in the future of AI being successful. And I think to kind of sift through all, because I think the origin of my question, what I want to leave with the audience is like, yes, there's a lot of noise. You don't have to read every single thing. Not everybody is a journalist covering AI in education. But I think it is important to find some smart people that you trust. And when you're trying to figure out, is this like legit? Like, is there a there? You don't want to be relying on, the you don't necessarily be on the bandwagon while you're evaluating that, and especially for decision makers who are education systems. I think they're dealing with this a lot right now. A lot of AI conferences are, 95% of the people who are there and the sponsors are all, aggressively pro AI and AI products. And in reality, I think it's much more of, I don't know if it's 50-50 exactly, but it's definitely not 95% good and 5% we just have to figure it out. It's like it's much more complex. And so the information ecosystem is not, I don't think it's very balanced. I think it's oriented very heavily. And then you have and a lot of the skeptics or a lot of the pessimists are not useful because they're like the existential risk folks who are worried about, the singularity. And
right.
I find that a very interesting philosophical discussion. I just don't think there's anything actionable that certainly an education leader can do besides pay attention and keep your eye out for AGI.
And I think, I mean, to be fair, a lot of skeptics, I think, have a different view of education than maybe you or I might have. They have they see it as a different kind of enterprise. And some wouldn't even be willing to, entertain, functions of a teacher, being, augmented in certain ways by technology. So I want to be clear on that. I guess where I come into it is I'm really interested to to read and to talk to the makers, the vendors, the people who run a lot of these outfits, just to see what they think they're doing, like what their place is and all this. And some of them have really interesting ways of thinking about this stuff, and really interesting ways of thinking, like, here's our niche, or here's all we want to do.
Well, I guess you can't plug yourself, but I will. I think while it's not everybody can necessarily talk to the founders of companies like this, I think reporting like yours, you're not blindly excited, but you're intensely curious, and I think you're willing to. I think this orientation towards like the future of high school is like an interesting place to come at this from as a journalist, because your incentive is for schools to transform for the better, and so there's a desire for things to be. I can sense a desire for us realizing the potential that AI has, and yet I think you've been in this long enough that you know that there's generally more to it than some of the first claims, I suppose, that are made.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
All right, Greg, thank you so much for coming by.
It's been fun.